David Crockett Scout by Charles Fletcher Allen. Chapter 17. Davy's Popularity. Rejoicing in the East over Davy's re-election. One of his attacks upon Jackson in Congress. He undertakes a journey to the Atlantic cities. Starts for Baltimore by stage. The steamboat Carroll of Carrollton. Davy first sees a railway train. A grand welcome in Philadelphia. Davy addresses 5,000 people in front of the Exchange. He visits Fairmount, United States Mint, the Walnut Street Theater, and sees Jim Crow. His reflections upon Eastern manners. He is dined by the young Whigs. Gives directions for making the celebrated rifle Betsy the gift of Philadelphia admirers. The news of Davy Crockett's re-election, in spite of the opposition of the Jackson party, was received in the Eastern States with joy, and even the Southern States of the Atlantic coast, hugging to their bosoms the fragments of the new idol of nullification, heard of the backwoodsman's victory with grim satisfaction. Clay and Webster and John Quincy Adams stood with such men as Albert Gallatin and the Quaker statesmen of Philadelphia. The voters who had made the hero of the treaty at Hickory Grove their president still had a kindly feeling for the man who had dared to offer an honest opposition to the irascible old general. The wily politicians cultivated the renown of Davy Crockett as a plant of great promise that might even make presidential timber. Davy's opposition to Andrew Jackson was outspoken and undisguised. After his tour of the Eastern cities, to be hereinafter described, he spoke in Congress upon the subject of the bill making appropriations for fortifications. The records show that his words were in part as follows: "Sir, we have no government but Andrew Jackson, without secretaries, and, sir, he is surrounded by a set of imps of famine that are as hungry as the flies that we have read of in Aesop's fables, that come after the fox and sucked his blood. Sir, they are a hungry swarm, and will lick up every dollar of the public money." Mr. Dunlap of Tennessee replied to Crockett with heated language, and Crockett again took the floor to reply, saying that he wished it to be distinctly understood that he took back nothing that he had said, but that he would reassert everything and go even further. Standing in his place for almost the last time, he lifted his hand in passionate protest against the proposed use of the public funds, and took his seat with these words: "We have no government at all. God only knows what is to become of the country in these days of misrule. Sir, I am done." Such attitude as this accounts for the infinite pains with which the opposition fought him 2 years later in his campaign for a fourth term. While he was attending to his congressional duties, his political fences were demolished by the stay at homes, and in their places were set up what in these days of such unsightly nuisances might be called the billboards of partisan defamation. The comparatively inactive life of a congressman had begun to tell upon the scout and bear hunter of the Mississippi cane. He decided to take a trip through the Eastern States for the benefit of his health. Although it was in the midst of the spring session of Congress, he left Washington on the 25th of April, 1834, and did not return until the latter part of June. He says of this proposed journey: "During this session of Congress I thought I would take a travel through the Northern States. I had braved the lonely forests of the West. I had shouldered the warrior's rifle in the far South. But the North and East I had never seen. I seemed to like members of Congress who came from these parts, and wished to know what kind of constituents they had." Up to this time his knowledge of the East was confined to Baltimore and Washington. He had read and heard much of the wonders of the great cities of the Atlantic seaboard, but he had never felt free to describe them to his fellow citizens of western Tennessee. He has left no word regarding his impressions of the nation's capital. It would be interesting to compare his views with those of Charles Dickens, who visited many of the same cities a few years later. This is what Dickens thought of Washington in 1842. Take the worst parts of the city road and Pentonville, or the straggling outskirts of Paris, where the houses are smallest, preserving all their oddities, but especially the small shops and dwellings occupied in Pentonville, but not in Washington, by furniture brokers, keepers of poor eating houses, and fanciers of birds. Burn the whole down, build it up again in wood and plaster, widen it a little, throw in part of St. John's Wood, put green blinds outside all the private houses with a red curtain and a white one in every window, plow up all the roads, plant a great deal of coarse turf in every place where it ought not to be, erect 3 handsome buildings in stone and marble, anywhere but the more entirely out of everybody's way, the better. Call one the post office, one the patent office, and one the treasury. Make it scorching hot in the morning and freezing cold in the afternoon, with an occasional tornado of wind and dust. Leave a brick field without the bricks in all central places where a street may naturally be expected, and that is Washington. From this sort of place, perhaps even less beautiful, Davy was whirled away on the April morning before mentioned, viewing from his seat on the top of a great coach the roadside scenes between Washington and Baltimore. Upon arriving at the latter city, he put up at Barnum's Hotel, kept by Uncle Davy, whom he gladly hailed as a namesake. He says that no one would find better quarters or a more hospitable city. He was asked to dine with his friend Wilkes and other Baltimore gentlemen, and spent the evening pleasantly in their company. The next morning he was up early in order to take the steamboat to Philadelphia. At this time only 17 miles of railroad existed between the two cities, crossing the land in the vicinity of Wilmington and Havre de Grace. It was called the Charlestown and Augusta Railway. The departure from Baltimore seems to have given Davy a sense of lonesomeness. He felt what so many others since have felt, poor human mites among a swarm of busy ants, that the loneliest place in all the world is a great city. He realized, and tells us so, that the tens of thousands who passed him by in the noisy streets neither knew nor cared who he might be, and that at the best he might expect to be valued at about the price of a coonskin. This we have already seen to be no more than a York shilling, or a quart of New England rum. The steamboat, says Davy, was the Carroll of Carrollton, a fine craft, with the rum old Commodore Chaytor for head man. A good fellow he is, all sorts of a man, bowing and scraping to the ladies, nodding to the gentlemen, cursing the crew, and his right eye broadcast upon the opposition line, all at the same time. Let go, says the old one, and off we walked in prime style. They soon passed Fort McHenry, forever glorified by the stubborn defense that has made the Star Spangled Banner our national song of victory, and North Point was pointed out to Davy as the spot where the British had once planned to land their attacking forces. The run to Charleston was soon finished, and here Davy saw the sight of his life, a train on the 17-mile railroad between Delaware City and Chesapeake Bay. As the first locomotive in the United States came from England in 1825, it may be believed that what Davy saw in 1834 would be almost as astonishing to people of today. A dozen vehicles that resembled old-fashioned coaches stood in line on the flat rails that formed the railroad, while an ungainly locomotive with a smokestack nearly as large as the boiler, and with a flat car behind, loaded with wood and barrels of water for use on the run, was blowing off steam and showing every sign of a desire to make a start. The locomotive looked much like the kind now used by threshing outfits. Behold, then, Davy seated upon the top of one of the coaches, as if on a diligence in the days of Claude Duval, intent upon every move. After a good deal of fuss, we all got seated and moved slowly off, the engine wheezing as if she had the tizzic. By and by, she began to take short breaths, and away we went with a blue streak after us. Soon after starting, a team was sighted in the gathering darkness of the evening. When they saw the shower of sparks from the stack of the infernal machine that was coming towards them, the horses ran away with a right good will, upsetting the wagon and scattering the freight along the way. Let us now follow Davy's own story of his visit. After the dinner on the boat, he went on deck, in time to see that a great display of flags was taking place on board. When he asked the reason, the captain told him that it was to be a signal that Crockett was coming, given on account of the desire of the Philadelphia people to meet him at the wharf. "We went on till we came in sight of the city," says Davy's account, "and as we drew near to the wharf I saw the whole face of the earth covered with people, all anxiously looking on towards the boat. The captain and myself were standing on the bow deck. He pointed his finger at me, and people slung their hats and huzzaed for Colonel Crockett. It struck me with astonishment to hear a strange people huzzaing for me, and made me feel sort of queer. But I had to meet it, and so I stepped on the wharf, where the folks came crowding around me, saying, 'Give me the hand of an honest man.' I did not know what all this meant, but some gentlemen took hold of me, and, pressing through the crowd, put me into an elegant barouche, drawn by 4 fine horses. Then they told me to bow to the people. I did so, and with much difficulty we moved off. The streets were crowded to a great distance, and the windows full of people, looking out, I suppose, to see the wild man. I thought I would rather be in the wilderness, with my gun and my dogs, than to be attracting all that fuss. I had never seen the like before, and did not know exactly what to say or do. After some time we reached the United States Hotel in Chestnut Street. The crowd having followed his carriage to the hotel, Davy at last showed himself upon the balcony front, bowing repeatedly with hat in hand, as we have seen Taft and Roosevelt do upon so many occasions in these days of presidential travel. At the last he was constrained to speak a few words of thanks, in which he recognized the existence of a state of high excitement in political affairs, which he wished to make no worse. He promised to speak again at 1 o'clock the next afternoon, and then withdrew. That night, as he lay restless in a strange place, he looked forward to the promised speech with much doubt and fear, but at last consoled himself by trusting to the good luck that had already got him through many a scrape before. The next morning Judge Baldwin, Judge Hemphill, John Sargent, and others called upon Davy, and afterwards he was invited to visit the Fairmont Waterworks, then the pride of the whole state. He was astonished at the volume of water lifted by few wheels, but even more so by the lavish use of the supply. He says that such scrubbing of steps and even of pavements he had never seen, and he strongly suspected the housemaids of having webbed feet. The next place visited was the Mint, and the sight of real money, as he calls it, stirred him to comment upon the flood of paper then in circulation. The statement made to Davy that the workmen were too much accustomed to handling coin ever to think of stealing it was a poser. He had thought that Such constant temptation was the most powerful cause of crime. During the forenoon a visit was made to the Asylum for the Insane, whereat Davy thanked God for the bounty and humaneness of the city in thus providing for the unfortunates within its walls. When the round of the city had been made, the time for the promised speech had nearly arrived. He says that he had made set speeches in Congress when all his colleagues were against him, and further, I had made stump speeches at home in the face of all the little office yelpers who were opposed to me. But indeed, when I got in sight of the exchange and saw the streets crowded, I most wished to take back my promise. But I was brought up by hearing a youngster say as I passed, "Go ahead, Davy Crockett." I said to myself, I have faced the enemy. These are friends. I have fronted the savage red men of the forest. These are civilized. I'll keep cool and let them have it. Davy went to the exchange and in a few moments stood before that great crowd, bowing in response to the continued cheering that delayed the possibility of his being heard. He says there were 5,000 people in front of the building. It was Philadelphia exalting to the skies the symbolism of its dislike and hatred of Andrew Jackson, personified in the wild man from the West. For half an hour Davy spoke to the immense audience, and for an hour afterwards stood upon the steps of the exchange, shaking hands with eager admirers. Here is the spectacle of a man who had risen, as we have seen, from the lowly log house settlement of the western slopes, unschooled, unpolished, except by the rude processes of hardships and necessity, yet who could rise to such self-command as this. Thousands of men of the higher order of the educated fail when they try to think and talk at the same time. The possibilities that were in Davy Crockett's pathway were without limit. A vision of political greatness hovered about his pillow in the midnight hours, and beckoned him onward in the glare of day. That he should thus be known by the people of the seaboard filled his soul with pride and his heart with hope. He forgot the bitter words he had spoken in honest wrath against what he believed to be the misdeeds of the administration of Andrew Jackson. Like one camping in the peaceful forest, unmindful of the stern and silent foe upon his trail, he rested in a contentment that was undisturbed by doubt. He looked forward to re-election the next year, or to a gift from the people of even greater power. There is no sign of his honest nature being spoiled by so much attention. He was never blind to the possibility of deception in the adulation of the public, but the loud cheers of the men of the Quaker City rang true in his ears, and he believed them as sincere as himself. In the evening, Davy visited the Walnut Street Theater, where he saw Jim Crow, "as good a nigger," he says, "as if he was clean black, except the bandy legs." After the theater, Davy said that he thought his own people found quite as much pleasure in their own simple recreations as did the city folks in their more expensive and showy ones, and against anything the city could show he would put the fun of an all-night country dance. "It would do you good to see our boys and girls dancing," said he. "None of your straddling and mincing and sadieing, but a regular sifter, cut the buckle, chicken flutter set to." It is well sometimes to get another view of ourselves from such a standpoint as Davy's. The Philadelphia people, especially the politicians of the Whig party, outdid themselves in entertaining the hero of the hour. The next morning he was presented with a $40 seal for his watch chain. The design showed a match race, as he styles it, with two horses at full speed, and with the motto, "Go ahead." He thought it the finest seal he had ever seen, and says that after his return to Washington in June, the members of Congress almost wore it out in making impressions to send all over the country. The seal had hardly been presented before Mr. James Sanderson was announced. He had come to ask Davy for his wishes and advice in procuring a rifle that the young Whigs of the city desired to present to Colonel Crockett. Davy was perhaps more pleased with this gift than by any other that could have been offered him. He gave the specifications as to size, weight, and so on, and it was arranged that the rifle should be given to him on his way back to Congress. On Tuesday, Davy visited the Navy Yard and saw on the stocks the largest ship that had ever been laid down in the United States. He also visited the Schuylkill Bridge, and was shown the railroad that had been extended 100 miles into the state without making any fuss about it. Upon seeing Girard College, he remarked that blood is thicker than water, and that he would have made his own kin rich first of all, and afterwards might have given away the rest. His last evening was the occasion for a picnic supper. He says this meant as much as he and his friends could eat and drink with nothing to pay. End of chapter 17. Recording by Bill Mosley, Llano County, Texas, USA, September 1, 2023. Chapter 18. Traveling Hard. Davy visits New York City. His astonishment at the sight of the shipping. Davy wants to run to every fire. He visits Peale's museum. Whole rows of little bugs and such like varmints. Dined by the young Whigs of New York. The 1st of May was moving day. Meets Albert Gallatin, whose house is being demolished to make room for the Astor Tavern. Visits the 5 Points, and sees an artillery parade at the Battery. A rifle match at Jersey City. His journey is continued to Boston by way of Hell Gate and Providence. Davy is welcomed at the Tremont Tavern. Visits Faneuil Hall, Bunker Hill, the Constitution, and is the guest of the young Whigs. Makes a speech to a meeting in front of the State House, and visits Lowell. Davy is given a broadcloth suit made from Mississippi wool. He returns to Washington. The news from Texas in 1834. The next day, the 29th of April, according to his story, Davy went to New York by steamboat up the Delaware, thence by rail to Perth Amboy, and then again by boat. He says New York was certainly a bulger, and especially was he astonished by the forest of masts at the wharves. At the dock he was met by a committee and a crowd anxious to see him. After 3 cheers had been given and repeated, a committee representing the young Whigs escorted him to the American Hotel, where many New Yorkers had gathered to meet him. That afternoon Davy was taken to see the new fire engine, and then saw Fanny Kemble play at the Park Theater. He pays an honest tribute to that charming actress when he says, "She is like a handsome piece of changeable silk, first one color and then another, but always the clean thing." While here a sudden alarm of fire was heard. Davy jumped for his hat, and almost had to be held by his friends to keep him from rushing into the street. He told them that many a time he had ridden bareback to fires in his own neighborhood, and the city's indifference to such exciting happenings was hard for him to understand. During the 31st, Davy visited some of the newspaper offices, among them those of the Courier, the Enquirer, and the Star. Then he saw Pearl Street, making his way with much dodging about through the boxes that covered the sidewalks. His party next took in the Stock Exchange, and before he left he made a speech from the steps leading down to the main floor. Returning to the hotel for dinner, he visited with friends until they all decided to go to Peale's museum. This, says Davy, was over my head. He makes no attempt to describe what he saw, but was filled with wonder at seeing whole rows of little bugs and such like varmints set up in boxes, and could not see why they should be thought worthy of exhibition. From the museum, Davy went to the city hall, where he met the mayor, who had once been a tanner, and Davy remarked to him that they had both clum a long way up from where they started. Before leaving the city hall, he was invited to dine at Colonel Draper's, where he met Major Jack Downing, then a great celebrity. Next came an invitation to sup with the young Whigs. "Well, now," says Davy, "they'd better keep some of these things for somebody else to eat, thinks I, for I'm sure as full as a young cub." But the invitation was accepted, after Judge Clayton of Georgia had made a speech that made the tumblers hop. Colonel Crockett was formally toasted as the undeviating supporter of the Constitution and the laws. He responded to the toast in a short speech, in which he referred to the impossibility of plowing a straight furrow towards the cow that kept moving about. If he had followed Jackson, he said, his furrow would have been as crooked as the one made by the boy who had plowed all the forenoon after that kind of cow. The next day was the 1st of May, and while driving about in a barouche with Colonel S.D. Jackson, he was astonished at the number of loads of furniture he saw in the streets. When told that it was moving day, he remarked that it would take a good deal to get him out of his own log house. Such restlessness was beyond his understanding. They then drove to the 5 points, which Dickens said could be backed, in respect to wretchedness, against 7 Dials or any other part of St. Giles. The sight of so much squalor and misery made Davy wonder what could induce human beings to stay in such places, instead of clearing out for a new country, where every hide hangs by his own tail. As Davy walked back to the American Hotel, after leaving the colonel, he was introduced to Albert Gallatin, the celebrated scholar, volunteer soldier, suppressor of the whiskey insurrection, and Jefferson's Secretary of the Treasury. The old veteran of 73, straw hat in hand, was also moving, Davy says. He pointed out to him the house he was leaving, which was about to be torn down, with others to be replaced by a big tavern to be built by John Jacob Astor, and to cover a whole square. Before Davy left, a day or so later, he saw the roofs of the houses torn off by the workmen. The big tavern was the famous Astor House. Sometime during the same day, a new flag was hoisted at the Battery, then the favorite promenade of the fashionables of the city. Davy was invited, and witnessed a parade of the artillery under command of General Morton, formerly of the Revolutionary Army. An entertainment followed, in which eating and drinking played the usual prominent part. Davy seems to have been greatly pleased with the Battery and its views of the bay and islands about. "It is a beautiful meadow of a place," he says, "all measured off with nice walks of gravel between the grass plats, full of big shade trees, and filled with people and a great many children that come there to get the fresh air that comes off the water of the bay." Early the next morning Davy visited Thorburn's renowned seed store, and from there went to a rifle match in Jersey City. There he hit a quarter at 40 yards, offhand with a strange gun, and made other shots that sustained his reputation as a marksman. He was used up with sightseeing, and was glad to go to Boston at the invitation of another new made friend, Captain Comstock, in command of one of the Long Island steamboats. On the way to the dock, they drove around through South and Front Streets. Here the queen clippers of the world lay moored, with their bowsprits high above the pavements, and their rigged-in jib booms almost touching the buildings along the waterfront. At 3 o'clock the steamer Providence sailed with Davy on board, but not until a crowd of people had come to see him off. He responded with many bows, and the ship slipped out of the dock amid the cheers of the multitude. The passengers then gathered about him, and before their curiosity was satisfied, the city was out of sight. As they passed through Hellgate, a large full-rigged British ship was seen coming in from the other side. This sight was an object lesson as to the need of coast defenses. Davy was a good sailor, and walked the decks off Point Judith the next morning without being seasick in the least. The sun came up like a ball of fire, and Davy says that it looked as if it was brand new. The sight of many stone fences amused him greatly, and he remarked that one of his cows would pitch over a dozen of that kind without flirting her tail. At Providence, where they landed about noon, another crowd greeted him. Refusing an invitation to stop at that city, Davy took his seat in the fast stage for Boston. The driver was ordered to go ahead, says Davy, and sure enough he did. It was 40 miles to Boston, and we run it down in 4 hours. The stony nature of the land was a source of surprise to Davy, accustomed to the rich alluvium of Tennessee. He says the stones covered the earth as thick as Kentucky land titles, and he wondered why the Lord hadn't sent the Pilgrims better pilots. Arrived in Boston, Davy landed at the Tremont House, which he calls a tavern, kept by Mr. Boyden. Mr. Boyden did not know me, says Davy, nor me him, but when I told him my name, where they put it on the bar hook, he treated me like an old friend, and continued to do so all the time I was there. He gave me a good room and a nice bed, and attended to me the kindest in the world. I'd seen a great many fine taverns, but take this in and out, and Tremont House is a smart chance ahead. The first day in Boston was the occasion of a visit to Faneuil Hall, where General Davis showed Davy the arms and cannon of the state militia. The complete order, and the realization of the possibility of sending out the troops at a few minutes' notice, deeply impressed the former scout. General Davis informed me, he says, that this was the house that was called the Cradle of Liberty. I reckon that old King George thought they were thunderin' fine children that was rocked in it, and a good many of them, and that no wonder his redcoats were licked when the children came out with soldier clothes on and muskets in their hands. God grant that the liberty bough on which this cradle rocks may never break. At Roxbury, Davy was given a rubber hunting coat, something entirely novel to him. This coat he afterwards took with him when he went to Texas. He next visited the good ship Constitution and the battleground of Bunker Hill, where the great monument was already begun. I felt like calling them up, he said, and asking them to tell me how to help best to protect the liberty they bought for us with their blood. But as I could not do so, I resolved on that holy ground to go for my country, and always and everywhere. These were no idle words that Davy spoke. Out of many invitations to dinner offered by the hospitable citizens, Davy chose that of the young Whigs, at which 100 were present. This was perhaps the crowning festivity of his journey. Another day was taken up in viewing the Commons, in climbing to the dome of the State House, and in entertaining with one of the Western speeches a great crowd in front of that building. He declined an invitation to visit Harvard. In telling of this, he says that he would run no risk of having LL.D. tacked on to his name. There had been one doctor made from Tennessee already, and I had no wish to put on the cap and bells. This is a reference to Jackson. Everywhere he went, Davy found new evidences of friendship and hospitality. In Lowell, Mr. Lawrence presented to him a fine piece of broadcloth made from Mississippi wool. There was also another dinner there, as well attended as that given by the young Whigs at Boston. When Davy called for his score at the Tremont House, before leaving for New York, he was told that he was an honored guest, and that there was nothing to pay. He was warmed through and through with New England hospitality, and left Boston with a heart full of gratitude. His return to Washington by way of Providence, New York, and Philadelphia, was uneventful, except that his pocketbook was stolen at Camden, with $160 in money, a sum of much importance in a time when money was hard to get. Tired out with his continuous round of pleasure, Davy was glad to get back to his seat in Congress, where he was welcomed by his fellow members as a man who had reaped special honor and distinction from the exclusives of the older states. He was in Washington but a few days before Congress adjourned. The year 1834 is memorable for the election of Abraham Lincoln as a member of the Illinois legislature, and for the emancipation of all slaves in the British colonies. The presence of General Sam Houston in Texas had begun to lead to results. Already the Americans in that part of Mexico had taken the bit in their teeth, and were running things as if they recognized no other authority than their own. They could not go back, nor did they wish to cross the great strip of sand and trickling water called the Grand River of the North. They purposed to rule to the Rio Grande's banks, and every man who went to Texas from the States carried a gun, lots of ammunition, and words of cheer. End of chapter 18. Recording by Bill Mosley, Llano County, Texas, USA, September 14th, 2023. Chapter 19. The Rifle Betsy. The adjournment of Congress. The Rifle Betsy is presented to David at Philadelphia. Meets Daniel Webster and others at the Fish House Club. He is given a supply of hunting powder by Mr. DuPont. The fast line to Pittsburgh by rail and canal. Charles Dickens' notes on the same route. Davy foretells the greatness of the Smoky City and the Keystone State. The voyage down the Ohio River. The greatest crowd that Louisville has ever seen. Arrival at Mills Point, and the homeward drive through the wilderness. The baying of the hounds at the sight of their master. More news from Texas. The expulsion of the gamblers from Mississippi. The adventurers flock to the Rio Grande. Another year at Washington. Davy returns over the mountain trail. Begins another campaign. When Congress adjourned about the 1st of July, 1834, Davy went to Philadelphia, intending to return to the Obion by way of the fast line of stages, canals, and steamboats between Harrisburg and Louisville. After he arrived at the United States Hotel, a committee waited upon him, and at an hour set for the event he was given the rifle which had been made for him under John M. Sanderson's direction. In reply to the speech of presentation, Davy used these memorable words: "If it should become necessary to use her in defense of liberty in my time, I will do as I have done before, and if in the struggle I am buried in the dust, I will leave her in the hands of some one who will honor your present in standing for our country's rights." The rifle was a fine specimen of the best Pennsylvania workmanship, and accompanying it were a tomahawk, hunting knife, and all the accoutrements that went with a gun. During the next few days Davy spoke at the Fourth of July performance in the Chestnut Street Theater, met Daniel Webster and other celebrities at the Fish House Club in the Schuylkill, and received a present of half a dozen canisters of the best brand of DuPont's powder from Mr. DuPont in person. He then started for Pittsburgh. Arriving at Harrisburg by rail, he took up his quarters upon the canal boat which Dickens has minutely described in the chapter ending with this mention of the stuffy cabin of the best packet on the line. No doubt it would have been a thought more comfortable if the driving rain, which now poured down more soakingly than ever, had admitted of a window being opened, or if our number had been something less than 30. But there was scarcely time to think as much when a train of 3 horses was attached to the tow rope. The boy upon the leader cracked his whip, the rudder creaked and groaned complainingly, and we had begun our journey. 2½ days were used up in going to the foothills of the Alleghany Mountains. Between the western end of the canal and the other or western side of the mountains, there was then a railway over which the cars or coaches were hauled by stationary engines, there being 5 inclines or switchbacks on each side. From this railway the trip continued by another canal, and upon the evening of the 4th day Davy found himself for the first time in the smoky city. He was enthusiastic over the future of the state. He saw in Pittsburgh a perfect workshop, increasing every year in extent, beauty, and population. His voyage down the Ohio was enlivened by salutes from the citizens of various towns, by speaking at Cincinnati, and by the gathering of the largest crowd that Louisville had ever known. Dickens gives this description of the voyage down the Ohio: "A fine broad river always, but in some parts much wider than in others, and then there is usually a green island covered with trees, dividing it into 2 streams. Occasionally we stop for a few minutes, maybe to take on wood, maybe for passengers, at some small town or city. I ought to say city. Every place is a city here. But the banks are for the most part deep solitudes, overgrown with trees, already in leaf and very green. For miles and miles and miles these solitudes are unbroken by any sign of human life or trace of human footstep, nor is anything seen to move about them but the blue jay, whose color is so bright and yet so delicate that it looks like a flying flower. At long intervals a log cabin, with its little space of cleared land about it, nestles under a rising ground, and sends its thread of blue smoke curling up into the sky. It stands in the corner of the poor field of wheat, which is full of great unsightly stumps, like earthly butcher's blocks. Sometimes the ground is only just now cleared, the felled trees lying yet upon the soil, and the log house only this morning begun. As we pass this clearing, the settler leans upon his axe or hammer, and looks wistfully at the people from the world. The children creep out of their temporary hut, which is like a gypsy tent upon the ground, and clap their hands and shout. The dog only glances round at us, and then looks up into his master's face again, as if he were rendered uneasy by any suspension of the common business, and had nothing more to do with pleasures, and there is still the same eternal foreground. From Louisville, Davy left for Mill's Point with his trunk, gun case, old lady's pitcher, a present for his wife, and all, and on July 22nd found his son William waiting for him with a team. After a rough drive of 35 miles, a glimpse of waving corn gleamed through the scattered pines, and like a voice from the other world rang the cry of the bear hunter through the wilderness. The scarred and sorrowful hounds about the cabin leaped to their feet as they caught the welcome sound, and with baying that gave the bears of the hurricane an uneasy quarter of an hour, the gaunt pack rushed to meet the master they loved so well. At his own door there was the joyful reunion to which, in the midst of civic honors and the luxuries of civilization, Davy had looked forward with unsuppressed longing. As the family and the neighbors crowded about him, he placed upon a rude mantel the china pitcher for his wife, and took from its leather case the splendid rifle given him in Philadelphia. There was joy and wonder in plenty for all. His suit of broadcloth was touched with something like awe and reverence by those who had worn homespun all their lives. When the neighbors came together from time to time, Davy heard the stories of some who were just from the Texas border, or from that unquiet land itself. There were 20,000 Americans already there, sullen with wrath against the officials of the dual government of Texas and Coahuila, who enforced harsh orders and arbitrary laws by means of renegades and ignorant natives in gaudy uniforms. No man like Stephen F. Austin could endure the sight of these rude and often bloodthirsty creatures. The man in a hunting coat became the natural enemy of the officer with gorgeous epaulets and dirty linen, who relied upon the glitter of a clumsy blade to overawe the keen-eyed rifleman from Kentucky and Tennessee. Such matters as these, frequently discussed, awoke in the hunters of the Obion a longing to free their friends and relatives from Mexican rule. The question of Mexico's right to rule was not considered. The 13 colonies had grown too great for the mother tree, and, taking new root in the land of their choice, had severed in the whirlwind passions of rebellion the ligaments that hampered both. There was at the bottom of the discontent in Texas the working of the old, invincible law, the simple plan, that they should take who have the power, and they should keep who can. In the summer of this year, the people of Vicksburg rose against the gamblers, thieves, and slave stealers that had become as fierce and daring as the fabled vampires of the Persian vales. Some they hanged, some they told to stand not upon the order of their going, while others, without warning, had taken a wise departure, heading toward the unsettled frontiers, especially Texas, as havens of refuge and fields for future operations. Side by side with sturdy settlers, Seeking homes on Texas soil in defiance of Santa Anna's edict, went the wandering pirates of Barataria Bay and Galveston Island, followers of Lafitte. They scented battle afar off, and added fuel to the beacon fires of revolution that blazed along the Rio Grande. When the time came for his return to Washington, Davy left for that city with regret that he could not try the new rifle along the banks of the Obion. He entrusted his political affairs to his friends, and went back to oppose Jackson, regardless of the consequences, which he had no idea would ever become serious. Before Davy had left Nashville, there came stirring news from Texas. A meeting of men favoring open rebellion had taken place at San Antonio in October, and Santa Anna had practically suspended the protection of civil government. The message of the President to Congress made but slight allusion to this state of affairs, but the interests of the South, seeking more slave territory, were in line with the friends of liberty, and the prospect of a war beyond the borders grew more imminent every day. Davy kept his ear to the ground and watched the progress of events with anxiety. After the same old round of wasted time, bitter speeches, and scant accomplishment, Congress adjourned, and Davy returned home by the old trail over the mountains. It was in June that he went down the western slopes of the range, through a wild waste of trees and flowers. In the cold coves the laurel still glowed, the lady slipper, least of all the orchid sisterhood, swung beside the way. The Indian pine gleamed like a ghostly memory of departed tribes. The violets were past their prime, yet their departing breath was sweeter in the blast of death than all the fragrance of the thyme. They were the same birds, it seemed, that flew like bits of flame across his boyhood paths. The bluebird and the yellow warbler still rivaled the scarlet tanager in their splendid liveries, while the thrush, the catbird, and the riotous mockingbird filled the wilderness with a flood of melodies. Past the tumbling cabin at the limestone's mouth, past the gentle confluence of the now tame Cove Creek with the Nolichucky, standing at last near the shaky tavern from which his father and mother had gone to their quiet graves, he longed for the sweet perplexities of his childhood, as one longs for a drink from the far-away mossy spring where the luscious berries grew, and the arbutus dropped fragrant petals to its edge. He would have rejoiced if the dear ones who had gone to rest might have known of the honors that had come to their barefoot boy. He was nearing 50 years now, and realized that all men wished to live long lives, yet would not grow old. Already the contest for re-election had begun in his district. He was confident, with yet a trace of the doubt that always precedes the unattained. He looked in mute farewell at the old scenes, and went his way. The political campaign was beginning to seethe with excitement. In the Eastern states some considerations of decency prevented utter recklessness in political warfare, but in a state which had not yet outgrown the knife and pistol methods of meeting slander, the owner of a paper had no idea of hanging for a lamb when he might easily take a sheep. The choicest Billingsgate and the most ingenious lying, emanating from all parts of candidates' districts at once, made fighting the slanderers almost too big a contract for one man. But the rifle was always carried, and a pair of pistols ready, and license of speech was thereby restricted in public. At one of the meetings Davy was asked why all the congressmen were not given rifles like his. He answered that he got the gun for being honest and supporting his country instead of bowing down and worshiping an idol. The idol, of course, being Andrew Jackson. The big fellow who was thus answered replied with a rather incredulous air that the statement was pretty strong. No stronger than true, was the quick response, as each man went his way. In everything Davy seems to have been certain that he was right. In his simple faith he thought himself sure of the support of all honest men, forgetting that even honest men may see through a glass darkly and differ much. End of chapter 19, read by Bill Mosley, Llano County, Texas, USA, April 21st, 2023. Chapter 20, Off for Texas. Davy is defeated for Congress. Another scalp for Old Hickory. Davy's defeat is a crushing blow. He decides to go to Texas, takes a sad leave of his family, and sets forth in hunting suit with Betsy over his shoulder. On board the Mediterranean to Helena, the $80,000 fund, of which Bowie, Fannin, Travis, and Crockett are named as trustees. More about Texas affairs. Davy starts from Little Rock for Fulton on the way to San Antonio. The traveling parson and the Washita. Davy's faith in God. Meets with Thimblerig, the gambler. The gambler enlists with Colonel Crockett. I begin this chapter, says Davy's account of the campaign, at home in Weakley County. I have just returned from a 2 weeks' electioneering canvass, and I have spoken every day to large concourses of people. With my competitor, I have him badly plagued, for he does not know as much about the government, the deposits, referring to the United States Bank, and the little Flying Dutchman, Van Buren, as I can tell the people, and at times he is as much bothered as a fly in a tar pot to get out of the mess. His name is Adam Huntsman. He lost a leg in an Indian fight, they say, during the last war, and the government run him on account of his military services. I tell him in my speech that I have great hopes of writing one more book, and that shall be The Second Fall of Adam, for he is on the eve of an almighty thrashing. He relishes the joke about as much as a doctor does his own physic. I handle the administration without gloves, and I do believe I will double my competitor if I have a fair shake and he does not work like a mole in the dark. Jacksonism is dying here faster than it ever sprung up, and I predict that the government will be the most unpopular man in 1 year more that ever had any pretensions to the high place he now fills. 4 weeks from tomorrow will end the dispute in our elections, and if old Adam is not beaten out of his hunting shirt, my name isn't Crockett. This was Davy's state of mind in July, 1835. The election took place about the 1st of August, and he had yet to learn that many of the fair words received and many of the promises were of no more value, to use his own words, than a flash in the pan when you have a good shot at a fat bear. Under the special directions of Andrew Jackson, every means of beating Davy Crockett was put in practice. Copies of the Globe, franked by his opponents, accused Davy of collecting excess mileage, of being a traitor to the interests of his state, of fawning upon the aristocrats of the Eastern states, of everything that could be urged against him. When the die was cast, he writes, in the gloom of defeat, these words: August 11th, 1835. I am now at home in Weakley County. My canvass is over, and the result is known. Contrary to all expectations, I am beaten 230 votes. From the best information I can get, and in this instance, I may say, bad is the best. I have been told by good men that some of the managers of the Union Bank at Jackson were heard to say, on the day of election, that they would give $25 a vote for enough votes to elect Mr. Huntsman. This is a pretty good price for a vote, and in ordinary times a round dozen might be got for the money. As my country no longer requires my services, I have made up my mind to go to Texas. My life has been one of danger, toil, and privation, but these difficulties I had to encounter at a time when I considered it nothing more than right good sport to surmount them. Now I start anew upon my own hook, and God only grant that it may be strong enough to support the weight hung upon it. I have a new row to hoe, a long and rough one, but, come what will, I'll go ahead. At a general meeting in his district, Davy spoke for the last time to the voters of western Tennessee, recounting his services and the unfair methods by which he thought himself to have been beaten. He made a pretty strong talk, and concluded by saying that he could not think it a fair fight, but that he was done with politics for the present, and that he was going to Texas. In all stories of Davy's life, the poem said to have been written by himself on the eve of his departure for Texas is given a prominent place. In his own story he says that it was as zigzag as a worm fence when first written, but was overhauled by one Peleg Longfellow, who could hardly have been a relative of H.W. Longfellow. After this, and much lopping of some lines and stretching out of others, Davy says he wished he might be shot, if it wasn't worse than ever. This is the concluding verse of the poem: Farewell to my country, I fought for thee well, when the savage rushed forth like the demons of hell. In peace or in war I have stood by thy side. My country, for thee I have lived, would have died, but am cast off, my career is now run, and I wander abroad like a prodigal son, where the wild savage roves, and the broad prairies spread. The fallen, despised, will again go ahead. Having now determined to cut out and quit the States until honest men should have a chance to work their way to the head of the heap, Davy said good-bye to his friends and his family, and started for Mill's Point to take a boat down the river. The thermometer stood somewhat below freezing point, he says, as I left my wife and children. Still there was some thawing about the eyelids, a thing that had not happened since I ran away from my father's house, when a thoughtless vagabond boy. I dressed myself in a clean hunting shirt, put on a new fox-skin cap with a tail hanging behind, took hold of my rifle Betsy, which all the world knows was presented to me by the patriots of Philadelphia, and thus equipped, started off to go ahead in a new world. It appears that up to this time Davy's account of his life had been taken down by the editor of his book or an assistant. From time to time more was added, evidently from notes or messages sent from the frontier. Manifestos signed by Davy Crockett bear no trace of his style, nor do the concluding chapters of his book, which he never saw completed. Whoever helped the rounding out of his narrative could easily have followed Davy in his wanderings, and it must be taken for granted that this was done. All through the book there is a random way of telling the story, but in no case, after careful study, does there appear any discrepancy. When Davy boarded the steamer Mediterranean at the Point, he was welcomed by many prominent men on the way to Arkansas and Texas. The steamboat was one of the finest on the river, and before her gangway was aboard, and the slowly turning paddle wheels had sent the surging waves against the muddy banks, Davy was the center of a group of bankers, soldiers, Indian fighters, gamblers, speculators, and all that then made the river their highway. They were interested in the future of Texas, and were determined to make it free of Mexican rule. In the spectacular figure of the famous scout, bear hunter, and congressman, they saw a new ideal. Such a history as his was rare to their experiences. They knew he might be relied upon for courage and honesty. When the Mediterranean tied up at Helena in a storm, a subscription of $80,000 for the Texan cause was made up on board. Davy Crockett, James Bowie, Colonel Hawkins, Captain Travis, and Captain Fannin were made trustees of this fund. Every one of these names is blazoned upon the Texan scroll of fame. The money was paid in, but in charge of John Slidell, Governor White, and S.S. Prentice, and was all used in freeing Texas from Mexico. Davy is said to have gone to New Orleans, and is known to have visited Natchez, stirring up the more peaceable to active interest in the affairs of the Americans threatened by the new attitude of the Mexican government. For 3 years all Mexican troops had been kept out of Texas. The latest news told of the coming of General Cos with a strong force, and the garrisoning of San Antonio by several hundred Mexican soldiers selected by orders from Santa Anna from the lowest classes, men who were ever ready to cut throats, plunder, or insult the colonists. With the money subscribed, the gathering supplies for the inevitable conflict went rapidly forward. The return of Stephen F. Austin after 8 months' captivity in Mexican prisons brought a new force into the field. The Americans cast bullets, looked to their priming, and built adobe forts under pretense of building homes. The slow ferment of racial hatred, the antipathies of men who worshiped God in different ways or not at all, the cherishing of the memories of murderous deeds on both sides, grew slowly into a flood of passion, fed by every heart-throb day and night. After various journeys along and about the Red River, Davy started for the front, where the old city of San Antonio de Bejar stood forever the center of bloody tragedies and bitter strife. After being entertained in true Western style at Little Rock, he set forth for Fulton, 120 miles across country. The citizens had given him a horse and saddle, and the company of 4 or 5 men bound for Washita River gave the party the appearance of a band of scouts. After a ride of 50 miles, they drew near the river, when sounds of music were heard. Hail Columbia rolled across the fringe of alders along the bank, but when they raised their voices in a cheer the playing stopped, to again break into that old sad song of vanished hopes, "Over the water to Charlie." Putting spurs to their tired horses, they came to the river's edge to look upon the spectacle of a traveling parson whom they had seen at Little Rock, sitting in a sulky in the middle of the swirling stream. His horse could barely keep his feet, and yet the parson played with a composure that told of his faith in a higher power. He had fiddled for more than an hour, not daring to turn or venture on, and when he was rescued by Davy's company, he was about used up. From this point Davy went on towards Fulton with the preacher as far as Greenville. As they rode along, the old parson spoke so warmly of the bountiful works of Providence that his faith was imparted to his companion. "We were alone in the wilderness," wrote Davy, "but all things told me that God was there. The thought renewed my strength and courage. I had left my country, felt somewhat like an outcast, but now I was conscious that there was One still watching over me. My soul leaped with joy at the thought. I never felt so grateful in all my life. I never before loved God so sincerely. I felt that I still had a friend." There are some that will sneer at Davy's confession of his faith and love, forgetting that the wandering outcast, even the worst of men, looks out sometimes from the darkest depths to the long-remembered sweetness of a mother's smile. How sharp the point of this remembrance is! The careless or the hardened shrink from tender memories, but sometimes in the moment of evil impulse or of passion's sway, their hands by these are stayed from wickedness. In such a heart as Davy Crockett's there will always burn the reverential fires that keep the soul alight. At Fulton, Davy took passage on a steamboat for Natchitoches in Louisiana. As the boat puffed its way down the writhing channel of the Red River, he noticed a small cluster of passengers intent upon something that seemed to be very amusing. "I drew nigh to the cluster," he says, "and seated on a chest was a tall, lank, sea-sarpent-looking blackleg, who was interesting the passengers by his skill at thimble rig, the shell game. At the same time he was picking up their shillings just as fast as a hungry gobbler would a pint of corn." Noticing Davy's interest in his actions, the gambler finally urged him to make a bet, whereupon Davy, knowing the trick, named the thimble under which the pea was resting, but insisted upon lifting it himself. The pea was there, and the gambler was obliged to treat the crowd about him. After the laugh was over, poor Thimblerig, as Davy calls him, had to forego his game, and soon came and started a conversation with the man who had outwitted him. He seemed to be a good-natured, intelligent sort of fellow, with a keen eye to the main chance. "He belonged to that numerous class," says Davy, "that you can trust as far as you can sling a bull by the tail, and no farther. All the time he was talking to me, he was seated upon a chest, playing mechanically with his pea and thimbles, as if he was afraid he would lose his sleight of hand." At Natchitoches, the gambler, deploring his past and the hopelessness of his leading an honest life, was told by Davy that if he could not really lead the life of an honest man, the next best thing was to die like a brave one. "Most men are remembered as they died," said Davy, "and not as they lived." "You are right, but how is this to be done?" "Come with me to Texas. Cut aloof from your degrading habits and associates, and in fighting for freedom, regain your own." The gambler started from the table at which he was sitting, seized Davy's hand, and exclaimed with kindling eyes, "I will be a man again, and live honestly, or die bravely. I will go with you to Texas." In this way was Thimblerig enlisted. His real name is not known. End of section 20, read by Bill Mosley, Llano County, Texas, USA, May 8th, 2023.